With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good Monday evening, everybody, and welcome to the program right here on Tactics. Whether you're joining us on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook Live, however you're watching us on the program, we certainly do appreciate making us a part of your busy day, and we strive to bring you all the great local news that we can right here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program this evening. This is truly a somber broadcast, and I hate the situations that bring these about, but one of the good things about this, and I actually had a conversation not too long ago with a friend of mine on more spiritual matters, is that sometimes when we look around, we see the world in a place that it looks like it's not possible that this is going according to God's plan. And it's true that evil and horrible things happening to people are not part of God's plan. But that God's plan can certainly be accomplished through events like this. And I think that that will give us some useful perspective for today, because the top story is of an incredibly somber note. Now, it is actually past the 48-hour threshold that I've set for myself, my 48-hour rule. I don't talk about the politics of an event and a tragedy until at least 48 hours after the event has transpired. This is, of course, talking about the Pensecola shooting that took place on Friday, so it has been significantly more than 48 hours. It's been actually a little over 72 hours, and so because of that, I am going to get into some of the politics, but I'm going to start out the way that I always do, just giving you the facts, and I won't give you my opinion until a little bit later. And another tradition that we have on this show that I would like to adhere to, even more so now than normal, is talk about the heroes before we talk about the villains. So here are the facts as we know them. First of all, this shooting took place in Pensacola. The shooting was by Saudi natives who were basically, the best way to describe this thing is it was some kind of exchange program. So basically, we have troops over in Saudi Arabia. We send some troops over there to be trained in some of their facilities. They send troops over here to be trained in our facilities. And so these were Saudi natives. They were not citizens. They were not members of the United States military. They were just training on this base and wound up opening fire on some of our brave men and women, killing 3 and injuring 8. That's what we understand so far. So the Naval Air Station in Pensacola was shot, and a mass shooting did take place on Friday. Although, technically speaking, this does not actually constitute a mass shooting in the traditional sense by the FBI, because for the FBI to consider something a mass shooting, it has to be 4 people that were killed other than the shooter themselves. And since the shooter, of course, died, but since the only people that were killed there were only 3 of them, technically, I don't believe this actually meets the definition of an FBI mass shooting. But, you know, you have 3 killed, you have 8 injured. This is what traditionally people would think of as a mass shooting. And of course, regardless of, even if it was just one person that was killed, and even if it wasn't an act of terror, it would still be a tragedy. But those are the facts as we have them right now. The weapon used was a Glock 45 9mm pistol, which, by the way, according to all records, are legally purchased. Now, this is an aspect of the story that I'm very fascinated in. And you guys know my political stances on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, all of that. But before we even get into that, just as curiosity as a broadcaster and a news person, I'm interested to see what it even means to legally purchase a firearm when you're a non-citizen military personnel visiting from a foreign land. I don't know what that process looks like. I can tell you that though the process is, in my opinion, overbearing for an American citizen to even get it, from a federal perspective at least, to get a firearm, I'm very curious as to you can actually be a foreign national that is over here. Granted, they're not illegal immigrants, they're here for a reason. But I'm honestly a little surprised that we even allow firearm purchases for people that are not here, not citizens. They're, of course, here legally, but they're not citizens. And so you really don't run into a Second Amendment rights conflict here just because, while, of course, the Second Amendment is a human right, it's also not one that the federal government has an obligation to protect. I'm not saying that they can't protect it. I'm also not saying that that inborn human right is not present in every single human being. I'm just saying that from a federal perspective, I'm kind of surprised that they haven't made that illegal, because the federal government has no obligation to protect that right for someone who is not a citizen of the United States of America. So that I'm just genuinely curious about, and I'd like to learn more about it, but that was the only detail that I could find. And of course, after this attack took place, it was ended, not voluntarily. Sheriff's deputies that reported and came onto the scene shot the person that was doing the killing, and he was killed on the spot. So that was a fitting end, which, as far as I'm concerned, was not nearly gruesome enough compared to the kind of person that he is and the kind of end that he deserved. But I'm not a vengeance guy, I'm a justice guy. There was a threat, the threat was removed. So I'm not going to dwell on the method. But suffice it to say that the shooter is no longer with us because deputies did their job. And we, of course, do salute all of our first responders that have to run towards the sound of gunfire as opposed to away from it, like the vast majority of us do, and wound up taking the attacker out. We certainly do salute the deputies that were able to do this, and there's no question that they saved lives. Now, the latest details in this story is that the FBI is investigating it as a terror attack. That came out just yesterday, that one of the representatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigations came out and said in an interview that they are looking at it as a terrorist attack. And so that, from a legal perspective, opens up some doors for them. It allows them to look into these people a little bit more seriously with a little bit more haste. And it also helps that the people involved, the ones that were the attackers, were not citizens, which also means that they don't have to worry about some of the, like I said, some of the constitutional rights that would normally be afforded to a U.S. citizen. And so that actually is a really positive thing, that the FBI kind of, because they're looking into it as a terrorist attack, has a few more tools at their disposal to get to the bottom of this. And one thing that is absolutely really just astounding is that the FBI is, of course, investigating it as a terrorist attack, as they should. But nobody with a functioning brain ever thought that this was anything other than a terror attack, considering the information that I already gave you. When it came out that the person who was doing the shooting was a Saudi national, somebody that was born in Saudi Arabia, that is a citizen of Saudi Arabia, it wasn't even something that you had to contemplate. It wasn't even something that took so long you had to ask yourself the question. Like when I heard that bit of news, and I'm sure that this is true for it's not because I'm a political analyst, this is true for 99% of the people out there that saw this. All of a sudden, when they heard the shooter was a Saudi national, you're like, oh, well, then it was obviously an act of terror. Well, that's not incorrect. I mean, we kind of knew that. Unless you were somebody that is a dyed-in-the-wool liberal that just believes that you can't assert things like that. I mean, I didn't know if it was a terrorist attack right off because, it could be any number of things. There have been many mass shootings that are not technically acts of terror. They're just random violence. You also have things like crime, organized crime, gang violence, those kind of things. There's a myriad of options that it could have been. But as soon as I heard it was a Saudi Arabia national, I was like, well, yeah, it's going to be terrorism then. And unfortunately, that has turned out to be the case. And anybody with a brain in their head could have figured that out just by knowing that piece of the story. But one thing that's really despicable about this is his fellow Saudis were filming the attack. and him saying despicable things about the United States, they were obviously doing this as a recruitment video of some kind. Whatever terror cell they belong to, or maybe even for the Saudi Americans themselves, or Saudi Arabians that want to come to America themselves. This may have been something that was trying to motivate that. We don't really know who their core audience is because they didn't say, but there's really no other reason for them to have videotaped this, especially since it's kind of proof that you were the ones doing it. You don't do that unless you're trying to get attention and call it to yourself. So these guys seem to know that they were going to get caught, that they were going to be killed for their trouble. And just like a suicide bomber, they decided to go out this way because it's what their religion teaches. Now, we did hear reports that other Saudis are being watched. Well, thank goodness. And I'm not talking about, this isn't a situation like we had in World War II, where there were Japanese Americans that had been here for several generations, and all of a sudden the Japanese are our enemies, and Woodrow Wilson's like, FDR's like, yep, let's go ahead and round them all up. No, that's not what happened. And that's not what's happening here, is what I mean to say. Of course, that did happen historically in World War II. What I'm talking about is that's not even close to the same thing as what happened here, because they're not putting every person that is of Saudi descent in America or even in the military under watch. What they are doing is placing specifically the people that are not American citizens that are here for this program. They have put them under watch, which, thank goodness, why were they even here to begin with? Seriously, I realize that this is a policy that has been going on since before Trump was the commander-in-chief. I get that. But who is sitting around thinking, like, how did this policy come to be? Who is sitting around thinking, we really need some people from Saudi Arabia. We need to bring them over here to the States and then train them in our military facilities so that they can get behind the scenes and see our tactics. And we really need to do that for Saudi troops. That's the most insane thing I have ever heard of. It's just absolutely absurd. And I don't understand the purpose. I don't understand how it benefits the American people, which ultimately should be the question that every single person asks of every military policy. And if you cannot justify how this directly or maybe even indirectly benefits the American people, that is a policy that should not exist. And I cannot, maybe there's a good reason out there. You're going to have to do an awful lot of convincing for me. But I cannot see or understand a legitimate reason for having basically an exchange student program with Saudi Arabia. Now, I get that Saudi Arabia is one of our allies, but I think we all know that Saudi Arabia is not a real ally. If Saudi Arabia believed that they could get away with stabbing us in the back without circumstance, without a coincidence, I'm using the wrong word there, without a consequence for that action, they would do it in a heartbeat. They are still a religious nation. They are a theocracy based on Islam. And they subscribe to a reading of Islam that teaches that you are supposed to be a theocracy, which means that they believe that ultimately America and every other non-Muslim nation will be taken over by Muslims. They believe that is the destiny of the world. Now, are they nicer to us than maybe Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran? Okay, they might be a little nicer to us, but ultimately their ideology really isn't that different. And this is really the thing that it all boils down to that they don't want to talk about. But this is an absurd policy. Now, as horrible as all these circumstances are, I would be horribly remiss to not bring out that there are heroes in this story. Of course, there was loss of life. Of course, there are grieving families right now, and one of those grieving families belongs to one of the heroes who lost his life trying to save others. Now, I want to introduce you to this person who, by the way, is an actual Alabama native. So not only is he an American hero, he is also a hometown hero. So this is a picture of the hero. This is a guy named Joshua Caleb Watson. He is 23, a fellow Caleb. He actually went by his middle name. So a fellow Caleb, that hits a little close to home for me as well. He is from Enterprise, Alabama, and was a recent graduate of the United States Naval Academy, just fresh out of the academy. And what happened, and the reason that we honor his sacrifice, is because after being shot multiple times, Caleb went to go find help. Not for himself. You would think that the first thing that you would do when you got shot multiple times by a terrorist is you'd start hunting for a paramedic, or you'd start looking for somebody, even if they're not a paramedic, to try to close up your wounds, to find cover, or if nothing else, just stay down and act dead and hope that they don't notice you and wait for medical assistance to arrive. Those are just several of the options that Caleb had. And really, could you blame him for doing any of those? I mean, the man did just get shot more than once. But you see, Caleb did something else. Caleb, with multiple gun wounds, runs to find help, not for himself, to save others. You remember that I told you that this terrorist, this piece of human debris, met his end at the other side of the firearm of a sheriff's deputy? The reason they were able to get to him so quickly, the reason that there are only 3 people that were killed and 8 people that were wounded in this attack, is because the sheriff deputies found him pretty quickly. And the reason that he was found so quickly is because Caleb found them and showed them, not pointed them in the right direction, at least that's not the implication I got from the story that I read, showed them where the attacker was. Now, perhaps he would have died anyway. That's a very real possibility. Perhaps, as injured as he was, there was nothing that he could have done, and that's a very likely scenario. And it's very possible that he knew that. But even if that's the case, even if him showing these first responders where the trouble was not an act of self-sacrifice and he would have died either way, we greatly commend that he chose to use his last moments on this earth trying to save the lives of others. Caleb Watson is a hero. And he grew up in the little town in South Alabama of Enterprise, just like many of you in the listening audience right now. I've been to Enterprise, I don't know how many times, just like any other little town in Alabama. I went down there because I was helping some of their FFA teams with the debate contest. I mean, it's that mundaneness that really brings it into us and hits home. And I think that the message that we should take away from that is that this is a guy with an upbringing probably very similar to the vast majority of us in the audience today. Just a kid from a small town that was patriotic and wanted to serve his country and wound up going to the Naval Academy. And yet, in one of the worst circumstances a human being can find themselves in, being confronted with death, he chose to use the last moments of his life, not selfishly, not worried about himself, but worried about his brothers that were in danger. And with his last effort, decided to make a difference for them. Our prayers go out to the Watson family. And Caleb, we commend your heroism, and it inspires us to remember that even with humble beginnings, we too can be heroic. I'm going to take a quick break here, and we'll be back in just a moment.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible, with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, everybody. If you're just now joining us from the break, before we were talking about the Pensecola shooting, and I know that I have my 48-hour rule, but it happened over the weekend, so it actually has been 48 hours, and so I am going to dive into some of the politics of this horrible tragedy. Ultimately, and I want to make this very clear, ultimately this is the fault of a vile ideology known as Islam. Ultimately, I'm not trying to blame society or the system or whatever, because when it all comes down to it, systems aside, politics aside, ultimately this is an act of evil, an act of hatred towards your fellow man. And that act of evil comes to you via the teachings of Islam. However, we all know that that is a possibility. We all understand that this is a reality of the world that we are currently living in. And that's why I have to ask some questions about, since we have that knowledge already, why were some of these decisions made? I already touched on one of these, but why on earth are we bringing non-citizens into our military facilities to train them? Now, it's a little odd, even if it were Israel, France, England, not, super inappropriate, but a little strange. At least with something like that, though, we don't have well, I say that France actually does have a real problem with terrorism inside their own borders. But some of the other countries, we at least know that they're allies, and if the people were, passing and vetting the system that they had to go through to be in that nation's military, then they're probably okay. Let's not kid ourselves on who Saudi Arabia is. Saudi Arabia is a nation that, because they like our money, tolerates us and acts as though they are our friends. They are no friends of liberty. They are no friends of ours. Do you know that out of all the terrorists that came together to organize 9/11, you know where they came from? Oh, well, they came from Afghanistan. No, all but one of them came from Saudi Arabia. The Taliban was operating inside Afghanistan, and these people had no doubt been to Afghanistan, but they were born and raised in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been a hotbed for terrorism for a very long time, and we pretend that it's not because we need their oil. That's what it all eventually boils down to. And the idea that we would be taking people from their military, implanting them into our own to give them military secrets, even if they never committed an act of terrorism, is patently absurd. And I don't understand why on earth this policy was put into place in the first place. It would not shock me to find out that it's an Obama-era policy. Honestly, it wouldn't shock me to find out it's a George W. Bush policy. I very much doubt that it would go back any further than that. But that should be the first question. Why was this even a thing? Why were there military agents from this foreign nation, which we know has problems with terrorism? Why were they allowed into this program in the first place? And obviously, it's not just one crazed lone wolf. There were multiple people, a splinter cell group, operating inside this program. Multiple people, because you had the shooter, but you also had people filming the thing as a terrorist recruitment video. This is not an isolated incident that just doesn't happen all that often within Saudi Arabia's borders. There's a reason they have so many terror attacks within their own country. And we don't need to be importing other people's problems. We have enough of our own. And another thing that is also absurd. Why are there no guns allowed on military bases? Now, granted, to his credit, and I'm about to be critical of him, but I agree with this policy, the Trump administration has been working to try to undo that rule. But there was a rule that you were not allowed to have a firearm on a military base. This shooting did take place, make no mistake about it, in a gun-free zone, just like over 99% of all mass shootings do. And so this is yet another example of a gun-free zone killing people as opposed to protecting them. These are people, members of the military, that are some of the finest gunmen on planet Earth. The young man that we just talked about, Caleb Watson, who heroically lost his life helping other people, he was on the rifle team. Not the rifle team for Auburn, though I'm sure they're impressive as well. Not the rifle team for Alabama, or Florida, or LSU. He was on the rifle team for the United States Naval Academy. I tend to think he's pretty handy with a firearm and kind of knows all the safety rules and regulations. Don't you think that if he had had a firearm, he probably would have been even more effective at saving lives and maybe could have saved even more than he did, saving them without a firearm? Oh, and by the way, how did he wind up rescuing people? How did he wind up saving people? By going and finding people that had guns. Why is the best trained military in the history of the human race not armed on their own bases? This policy could not make less sense if it tried. Even the vast majority of the Democrats agree that if you have a military background, you should kind of be fast-tracked for being able to carry a firearm. That's just common sense. Even most Democrats are on board with that. So why is this policy still in place? It just absolutely blows my mind that we're still having this conversation. Now, here's the bad. This is going to be a bad Trump day. I'm just going to tell you right now. There's days where I'm very complimentary of the president. There's days where, I'm just, yeah, get him, Trump. I mean, I'm on his side. But today, I try to call balls and strikes with the guy, and this one is a massive swing and a miss. Like, this is a swing and the miss where the pitcher didn't even throw the ball, You just swung at it beforehand and let go of the bat and broke the scoreboard. Like, this is a unmitigated disaster of a day for President Trump, because here's the thing. President Trump did not come out talking about either of these two questions. Why was this program instituted in the first place? And why do we not have military personnel armed on the facilities with their own firearms? Why are those two things true? Now, Trump, who is a political opportunist by anybody's definition, you would think that somebody like him, who made his way into the presidency with the America First, let's actually be smart about who we're letting into the country. We can't be importing other nations' problems. I'm not going to be politically correct when it comes to Islamic terrorism. The guy got into the White House on that platform. Why was he not talking about this? Why was he not on Twitter at 5 a.m. in the morning? That was redundant, 5 a.m. in the morning. Why was he not on Twitter early in the morning, as he normally is, giving commentary on the day and just laying it all out there? Because that's what you would expect from President Trump, right? Now, sometimes he even does it to his own detriment. I didn't even like the fact that, even though it was Islamic terrorism, for example, with the truck attack up in New York, I didn't like the fact that he was trying to capitalize on it and using it to push policies directly afterward. But after the dust settled, you would expect it, with Trump, before the dust settles. He doesn't have my 48-hour rule. But you would expect, when you hear this story, oh, Trump's going to have some stuff to say about this. Well, he did. But it was not what you were expecting. In fact, he was actually carrying the water for the Saudis and apologizing for them. It was very Obama-esque. This is a statement that I pulled from the Washington Post. So this is him in a statement the other day. They are devastated in Saudi Arabia, and the king will be involved in taking care of families and loved ones. He feels very strongly. He is very, very devastated by what happened and what took place. Likewise, the Crown Prince, they are devastated by what took place in Pensacola. This is President Trump's big response to what happens in Pensacola, is to tell us, no, the Saudis had nothing to do with it. They're very sorry about it. They're tore up about it. They're just as worried about it as we are. Are you freaking kidding me? The guy that got he's in office and where he is today because he was a firebrand that doesn't care who he offends. And now he's kissing the butt of the Saudis and covering for them, basically working as their PR guy on this. Why? This doesn't sound like the America First, Make America Great Again kind of policy that Trump is famous for. So there's got to be a good reason that he's doing all this, right? Well, I actually think that there is, and I don't think that we have to guess very much on it. And the reason that I say that is because you remember that he has kind of done this before. Because Trump seems to have no problem with talking about how China and the EU and Mexico and other nations are screwing us. And by the way, most of the time he's right on that. Sometimes the solutions I disagree with, but he's right on the fact that they're double dealing and trying to do us dirty. He's correct on that. And he has no problem calling out those nations. But all of a sudden, when we have actual Americans being killed here on our soil by members of a foreign military, oh, well, they're super sorry about it. And yeah, we have to remember that they're a great ally, and we hope that relations go well. What the crap, Trump? That couldn't be more out of character for you, except he gave us an explanation for why he is this way last year, November 2018. This was Trump after the journalist was killed by Saudi Arabia. This is his explanation.
They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment and other things from Russia and China. Russia and China would be very, very happy because right now we're doing very well against China. We're doing very well against everybody, including Russia, and I'm going to keep it that way. And I'm not going to tell a country that's spending hundreds of billions of dollars and has helped me do one thing very importantly, keep oil prices down so that they're not going to 100 and 150 a barrel. Right now, we have oil prices in great shape. I'm not going to destroy the world economy, and I'm not going to destroy the economy for our country by being foolish with Saudi Arabia. So I think the statement, wait a minute, I think the statement was pretty obvious what I said. It's about America first.
Give me a second. One of the things that's good about President Trump, and simultaneously is also the thing that's bad about President Trump, is that the man doesn't have a filter. When he thinks something, he's going to tell you about it. And he doesn't say something that has been workshopped by 50,000 people and carefully constructed. The guy goes off script all the time, and he's blunt. And that is an example of that. See, President Trump always says the things you're not supposed to say. And sometimes it's refreshing, sometimes it makes you disgusted, and sometimes it's exactly what you were afraid was true, and that's why it's so disgusting. But President Trump just basically laid out the rationale of not only him, but most of his predecessors. We can't make Saudi Arabia mad, because if we do, oil prices are going to spike. That's going to hurt me in the polls, and I got an election coming up. I mean, ultimately, that seems to be President Trump's motivation. He just told you the main thing that he's worried about are oil prices and weapons sales. Now, the truth is, the weapons sales, they help, but honestly, if that were to go away, that really wouldn't hurt us very much. Oil prices would have a very significant impact on the American economy as a whole. And right now, President Trump has a phenomenal economy that he can run on that record. And by the way, he should. I'm not saying that he shouldn't. I'm not saying he's wrong to do so. But President Trump's rationale for running interference for Saudi Arabia and not holding them accountable, the reason, and he just gave it in his own words, the reason is because he's worried that it would wreck his economy. And to be honest, it would probably be a pretty significant blow. But when you're willing to not call it like it is, when you're willing to roll over for Saudi Arabia because you know that we need their oil, that's not America first. That's putting yourself first because you're worried about how the people in Middle America, how the polls are going to react to that. And I'm not saying it's an insignificant consideration there. It would temporarily harm our economy, and this is part of the reason that I advocate us becoming energy independent. But what President Trump did was make a conscious decision to protect his reelection over the American people. Do not call balls and strikes on Saudi Arabia and tell it like it is and tell the truth. He deemed that not as important as keeping oil prices down. And that is something that the president should be ashamed of. The president has done a lot of things that I like, a lot of things that he deserves praise for. This is not one of those things. Because if this were happening, and the president in office were Obama, or Hillary Clinton, or Jeb Bush, we'll even use a Republican, Republicans would be losing their freaking minds right now over that response. And they would be saying that the reason is because he's worried about oil prices. So why is it in conservative circles, in Republican circles, you're not hearing similar sentiment? I thought the whole point of having Donald Trump, at least the way that it was explained to me countless times during the election, the whole point of having Donald Trump is that he wasn't a Jeb Bush, that he was going to be straight with you, that he wasn't going to put his own election ahead of the interest of the American people. He's a billionaire. He can't be bought off. He's not in it for himself. He's not doing it because of his own ego. What he's doing is for the American people. That's his first priority. That's why he says America first. Let's make America great again. I heard those talking points till I wanted to throw up. And to a great degree, a lot of those talking points wound up panning out a lot better than I thought they would. And I've given President Trump credit for that. But on this, he's behaving exactly the way that Jeb Bush would have. Now, Jeb Bush wouldn't have come out and told you that was his motivation. So I guess that is a point in Trump's favor. But if somebody is screwing you over, it's of little consolation whether they tell you they're doing it or not. Like, you're still the one getting the baseball bat in the face. If they say ahead of time, hey, I'm going to hit you in the face with a baseball bat, doesn't make your face hurt less. And that's essentially what just happened here. Now, kudos to President Trump for being honest about it, but you shouldn't have done it in the first place. And that's what really bothers me about this. Let us not kid ourselves about who our enemies are, because Obama made this mistake multiple times with multiple countries. He trusted Russia, he rolled over for them, he let them do whatever they want, and that's when they annexed Crimea, because they knew President Trump was not going to do a dang thing. He did it with Libya. He did it with Benghazi. He rolled over for them because he knew they were not going to do anything. Now, if President Trump in the next 24 hours drops a air bomb on Saudi Arabia or something like that, okay, yeah, I'll eat my words. Trump, was playing 8D chess the whole time and he was just waiting in the wings to do something like this in response. I'm not advocating for that, by the way. I'm just saying I would have to say, okay, well, yeah, he actually did give a pretty forceful response. But if anybody other than Donald Trump were doing this, the vast majority of Republicans out there would be livid and would be justified in doing so. So why are they being largely silent on this? That's what gets under my skin. All right, so before I have a brain aneurysm, I think we need to go ahead and move on. You may have noticed that I have said very little about the impeachment proceedings. And it's not because I think that they're unimportant. It is not as though I believe that this is something that is not going to be significant to my listeners. It's just A, I typically handle local news, and B, there's been so much of it, it's hard to even know where to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you sort of a basic brief summary of everything that happened while we were away, because you remember the last show that I did was actually on Wednesday, because I had prior engagements on Thursday, so I had to figure out something to do. So a lot has happened between Wednesday and now. I'm just going to give you a quick summary of it. First of all, this is, I think, the most significant moment of them all. It doesn't happen in testimony. It happens outside when somebody else was asked a question, but the spiritual implications of this, I think, are staggering. This is Nancy Pelosi when she's asked by a former Fox News reporter, currently works for, I believe, Salem Broadcasting, James Rosen, asking about whether or not Nancy Pelosi hates the president. Take a look.
Do you hate the president, Madam Speaker? Because
I don't hate anybody.
Representative Collins, the reason I asked.
You don't hate anybody, not anybody in the world. So don't accuse me.
I did not accuse you.
You did.
I asked a question.
You did. And
Representative Collins yesterday suggested that the Democrats are doing this simply because they don't like the
I
guy.
have nothing to do with it. Nothing to say with it.
I think it's an important
I
point.
think the president is a coward when it comes to helping our kids who are afraid of gun violence. I think he is cruel when he doesn't deal with helping our dreamers, of which we're very proud. I think he's in denial about the climate crisis. However, that's about the election. This is about the election. Take it up in the election. This is about the Constitution of the United States and the facts that lead to the president's violation of his oath of office. And as a Catholic, I resent your using the word hate in a sentence that addresses me. I don't hate anyone. I was raised in a way that is a heart full of love, and always prayed for the president. And I still pray for the president. I pray for the president all the time. So don't mess with me when it comes to words like that.
So there you have it, our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, righteously indignant at James Rosen for even asking the question, do you hate the president? Now, granted, he probably shouldn't have blurted it out starting out that way. He probably should have prefaced it by asking, well, I say that. Here's the thing. In the situation that he was in, I don't really blame him for that because he's trying to get her attention. He's trying to get her to say something because she's walking away from the podium. He's trying to ask a question that another representative brought up. He's not just asking out of his own curiosity or accusing her, as Pelosi characterized it. He is asking because a fellow representative said that about her. So he's just asking for a response. He doesn't lead with that. He leads with the question itself, and that's what gets her all up in a dander. But you notice Nancy Pelosi getting righteously indignant over even the suggestion that she might hate somebody because she is a Catholic. Now, for those of you that are keeping track at home, Nancy Pelosi is a Catholic that advocates for not only abortion, but abortion on demand, anywhere, anytime, up to the point of birth. There have been multiple bills on this where there were, for example, restrictions on 25 weeks or later. In other words, basically a ban on third trimester abortions. And Nancy Pelosi was like, no, none of that. When it comes to things like homosexual marriage, she is someone that believes her official stance is that homosexual marriage is something that should be sanctioned by the federal government. Now, it's one thing to have a libertarian stance like myself, which is the government ought to stay out of marriage entirely, and if that means that two dudes want to rent a hall and put a ring on each other, the law shouldn't get involved with that. But that's not Nancy Pelosi's stance. Nancy Pelosi's stance is the government needs to give them a certificate asserting that they are married and basically sponsoring their marriage and saying, no, this is a marriage. That's Nancy Pelosi's official position. Now, I do not claim to be an expert on Catholic doctrine, but the last time I checked, abortion is considered murder, and homosexuality is considered an abomination against God according to not just the scripture, which would be grounds enough, but actual Catholic teaching. So the idea that, well, I'm a Catholic, therefore I don't hate anybody, yeah, Nancy Pelosi holds quite a few beliefs that are not exactly in concert with Catholic orthodoxy. And so forgive us for thinking that maybe on the stance of hatred, you weren't exactly on the same page as the Catholics with that one either. It's not exactly a far stretch, but I love the media actually doing interference for it and trying to justify Nancy Pelosi's outburst here. This is an article in the Washington Post by Karen Tumulty. And it starts out here, Nancy Pelosi and that four-letter word, talking about hatred, of course. So here's how it goes. One of the things that every Catholic child is taught is that the word hate should never be used in connection with another human being. This admonition flows from the expansive Catholic interpretation of the Fifth Commandment. In a general audience last year in St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis declared that to hate is to murder in your heart. All right. I do not disagree with anything in the article so far. And I actually agree with this Catholic belief that broad interpretation of the Fifth Commandment is correct, because we see in the Sermon on the Mount later, Jesus actually references the Fifth Commandment and expands it to basically include that if anyone has hate in their heart towards their brother, he is guilty of murder. So this is in concert not only with Catholic doctrine, but with normal Christian doctrine. Here's the problem with that, though. Catholics also consider abortion actual murder. So if you're trying to sort this out in your head, Nancy Pelosi is still a good Catholic because she is against murder in your heart, in other words, hatred, which I agree with. But she's for actual murder, and therefore that's totally okay. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're going to be anti-murder and you see hatred as murder, I'm on board with that concept. But you can't say, well, I would never hate somebody because to hate somebody in your heart is murder. But then you support what your church teaches is actual murder. Doesn't make any sense. Your brand of Catholicism does not exactly leave me with a whole lot of confidence that because the Catholic Church says something is murder, that you're just going to abstain from it and every appearance of evil. You advocate for policies that the Catholic Church views as murder, so of course, it's understandable that a person would be a little fuzzy on how you would interpret hatred. This whole thing is completely illogical. So a little further down in the same article, her critics will question her sincerity. Oh, you think? Her critics will question her sincerity and point out that she is broken with Catholic teaching on big issues of doctrine, chief among them abortion. Quote, the church has their position and we have ours. Which is that a woman has free will given to her by God, Pelosi said in the New York Times in 2015. So, in other words, if I'm understanding you correctly, Nancy Pelosi's official position is that it's okay to engage in murder because you have free will. Well, is there any such thing as a murder that does not occur because of free will? I mean, let's look back at the first murder in the Bible, Cain and Abel. Well, the reason that Cain killed Abel is because he had free will. If he had no free will, if God had not given that to him, then he wouldn't be able to kill Cain. So, does that mean his murder wasn't really murder and God was just upset at him for nothing? Nancy Pelosi's brand of theology it throws all the rules out, basically to where she can make the rules up as she goes along. Unfortunately, that's the stance of quite a few people on both sides of the aisle, but Nancy Pelosi's is on full display, and she doesn't seem to have any understanding or sense of her own hypocrisy in this. Because if we're talking about free will being the virtue, then the shooters that she just talked about that are killing school children, which is a legitimate concern, which I understand. I think that her characterization of how President Trump handles it is incorrect, but she's just talking about how concerned she is about killing the children, and yet she endorses a policy that the Catholic Church says is murder. The shooters in those mass shootings had free will too. What's the difference? Because if free will just makes it all okay, well, then there's no such thing as a murder. And then, if free will is the ultimate virtue, then why is it okay to rob a child's free will? Because the children that are aborted, they have no free will in the matter at all. They don't get any say. In fact, the way that your free will is being exercised is to rob the free will of another individual. You've stolen every choice that they will ever get to make. So if preserving free will is the ultimate goal here, which, by the way, is a goal that I am on board with, and if that's actually what you want, then I'm with you. But if that's the case, then killing an unborn child is completely wrong because you're robbing them of literally 100% of their free will, of every choice they will ever make. All right, a little bit later in this article, but those who know her well insist religious belief is at the core of everything Nancy Pelosi does. There are two pillars in her life in terms of her beliefs: her Catholicism, a very deep faith, and her family. Her friend and fellow California Congresswoman Anna Eshoo told my colleague Paul Kane on Thursday. This is the authentic Nancy. No small part of that was the influence of her mother. I'm not going to lie to you, I can't even pronounce that name. A daily commutant who, at her funeral, was referred to as being molded by Regina Caleri, the Easter prayer to Mary. And then the article finishes up here. The speaker has said that she would rather be doing just about anything else right now. There is legislation she wants to pass on lowering prescription drug costs and combating voter suppression. Instead, she leads her party toward impeaching the president, driven by her sense of moral obligation, a call of constitutional duty, and yes, her values as a Catholic. All right, well, you don't get to arbitrarily assign values to your own religion that aren't there. Because what we're talking about there is lowering prescription drug costs and getting rid of voter suppression. Okay, well, I definitely can get on board with trying to figure out ways to lower prescription drug costs, and I'm definitely against voter suppression, but they're not exactly Catholic virtues, at least not ones that I'm aware of. I've never heard of them being held up as Christian virtues. I mean, I'm going through the Bible, and I don't remember Jesus ever belting out into a policy stance on that. I don't see that as happening. Now, there are certainly political issues where the Bible does have quite a bit to say on them, but to my knowledge, those are not one of them. To attribute a random value to bolster your political position when it's not there, that's what the Klan did. I mean, you do realize that, right? And this should be no surprise considering the Klan had very close ties to the Democrat Party. The Klan basically made up a whole bunch of arbitrary stuff and tried to claim it was the Bible and said that that's the reason it was okay for them to hate black people and Jews and everybody that wasn't white. You don't get to just arbitrarily say, yep, these are the values that we have, and by the way, we're getting this from Christian doctrine or Muslim doctrine or Hindu doctrine or whatever else. You have to actually show where it is. Show your work here, Nancy. And another thing that really sticks out to me here is that you'll notice when Nancy Pelosi says, well, I don't hate anybody, and the reason that you know that I don't hate anybody is because of my faith, the media not only takes her word for it, but actually steps up to the plate to defend her on that. When's the last time that you, as an evangelical Christian, said, no, I don't hate gay people. I think that they're living in a sinful lifestyle and what they're doing is wrong, but I don't hate them. Oh, you're automatically a bigot. You're automatically a racist. You're automatically a sexist. Doesn't matter. See, when the average Christian, anybody on the right, says, hey, I don't hate anybody. I speak out against certain things because I believe they're wrong, but I don't hate them. Well, you're labeled a bigot from then on out, and then nothing you ever do will be good enough to satisfy the SJW mob. But Nancy Pelosi, even though it's wildly inconsistent with the things that she herself has said, when she says, well, no, I don't hate anybody, they say, oh, yep, see, she's Catholic. Yep, her faith says that you can't hate people, so obviously she doesn't hate anyone. And will actually go after people that say that she does. Now, I can't look into Nancy Pelosi's heart. I can't say definitively that she hates President Trump because I can't do that. It's not something that I, as a mortal human being, has the ability to do. I could make a guess on it, and I would guess that there's some pretty strong-willed animosity, if nothing else, directed at Donald Trump, but I can't definitively say that she does hate the guy. But what I can say is that her Catholic faith is obviously not the thing that is keeping her from doing so. I mean, if this isn't straining at a gnat to swallow a camel, I don't know what is. If you're going to stand out in front of people and say, well, I can't say that I hate the person, I don't want to use the word hate against another human being because that would be wrong. That would be against my faith. But you're like, child murder? Yep, line them up. You can kind of see why people don't take your word at it, that your religion is the reason that you don't hate the guy. Maybe you don't, I don't know, but if so, it ain't your Catholic faith that's keeping you from doing it. Kind of along these same lines when it comes to impeachment. Speaking of people that very clearly hate the president, Pamela Karlan, who is an attorney that the Democrats brought in, she's just the most objective person that there's ever been. She goes on the stand the other day and she makes a joke about President Trump's son, which, yes, is stupid, yes, is mean-spirited. She later apologized for it, and I don't believe in dwelling on it. What amazed me is that so many people on the right were looking at this and pointing out the thing about Barron Trump and using his name as a joke in there. Look, the joke's dumb, it's not funny, and it's relatively harmless. To me, they're focusing on the wrong part of that clip. So here's the clip, and let me see if you can pick out what I'm talking about here that she says that's so egregious.
Do you hate the president, Madam Speaker? Because
Well, that wasn't it.
I don't hate anybody.
Representative Collins, reason I asked.
What comparisons, Professor Carlin, can we make between kings that the framers were afraid of and the president's conduct today?
So kings could do no wrong because the king's word was law. And contrary to what President Trump has said, Article 2 does not give him the power to do anything he wants. And I'll just give you one example that shows you the difference between him and a king, which is the Constitution says there can be no titles of nobility. So while the president can...
I'm sorry, my computer's going crazy today. I don't know why. Let's try this again.
What comparisons, Professor Carlin, can we make between kings that the framers were afraid of and the president's conduct today?
So kings could do no wrong because the king's word was law. And contrary to what President Trump has said, Article 2 does not give him the power to do anything he wants. And I'll just give you one example that shows you the difference between him and a king, which is the Constitution says there can be no titles of nobility. So while the president can name his son Baron, he can't make him a baron.
All right, so that's the thing that everybody was talking about, the whole Baron thing. Was it classless? Sure. Should she have done it? No, but she's since apologized for it. To me, the bigger sticking point is A, the leading question. Sheila Jackson, who is dumb as a sack of hammers, and she has proven this many, many times over. The most recent showing of this was when she thought that AR-15s fired 50 caliber rounds and were as heavy as 10 boxes, which you would almost just kind of write off as an ignorant Democrat until you remember that she started that story by saying, I've actually held an AR-15. So there's all myriad of reasons to just trust anything Sheila Jackson says, but if that's not a leading question, I don't know what is. So could you tell us the difference between President Trump as a king, between President Trump and a king? I mean, you could say literally anything and it would be painted because of the way the question is worded as a contrast. If somebody were to ask me, just because of my knowledge of the Constitution and history, so what's the difference in President Trump as a king? Well, that's obviously a leading question because any answer that I would give would be the difference between any president and a king, not just Trump. And so what she was basically doing was giving this attorney a license to bash the president and talk about how he's abusing power. Now, you'll notice that in that, she said that the president can't, as he has said many times, Article 2 doesn't give him unlimited power to do whatever he wants. Now, a constitutional scholar, President Trump is not, and I think anyone that says differently is kidding themselves. But the thing is, President Trump does not believe that Article 2 gives him absolute power to do whatever he wants, and I was trying to figure out where this came from, because I do remember people making this claim before. Apparently the Washington Post put together a video montage of him saying this, and since I was curious, I watched it and tracked down the clips in it. And just take a look and see for yourself. This is the Washington Post on Trump saying that Article 2 gives him the power to do whatever he wants.
Then I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president, but I don't even talk about that.
It's a thing called Article 2. Nobody ever mentions Article 2.
More importantly, Article 2 allows me to do whatever I want. Article 2 would have allowed me to fire him.
So it sounds
but
like
I wasn't going to fire. You know why? Because I watched Richard Nixon go around firing everybody, and that didn't work out too well. So, very simply, Article 2 would allow me to do.
I could have done anything I wanted. I don't even bring it up because we don't even get there. Absolutely, I have Article 2.
It gives me all of these rights at a level that nobody has ever seen before. We don't even talk about Article 2. So, they ruled no collusion, no obstruction. Very simple.
All right, so at the initial viewing, you would think, that's pretty damaging. That's pretty solid evidence that Trump actually does believe Article 2 gives him unlimited power to do whatever he wants as a president. The problem with that is, every single one of those clips was ripped completely out of context, because when you track down the videos of Trump doing that every single time he makes that point, he is doing so in reference to the special counsel. Now, to explain why that could make it look a lot worse than it is, because President Trump is not cautious in his speech. He is not good at measuring things and saying things in a way that they can't be ripped out of context. I mean, the guy walks around basically just creating sound bites for the left. And that's not a good thing that Trump does, but you also can't judge him out of context, just like you would not judge anybody else out of context. Whenever he made all of those statements, he was talking specifically about Robert Mueller. He was talking specifically about whether or not he could fire Robert Mueller as a special counsel, which, by the way, according to Article 2, he does have the authority to do. Trump's legal analysis is actually correct there. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to rip it out of context and say, see, he thinks that the president, according to Article 2, can do whatever he wants, that he's basically just a dictator. No, that's not the case. For example, if it were me, and let's say this was back when I had one of my producers, and there was a soundbite of me telling the producer to play something like, I don't think you're allowed to play that one. I was like, hey, it's my show. I can do whatever I want. Well, you couldn't go back and say, and take that soundbite out of context and say, see, Caleb Colquitt thinks that he's above the law. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. No, I was saying I could do whatever I want in this specific situation. And President Trump was doing exactly that. He's saying in regards to firing the special counsel, he had the authority to do so, which, by the way, he did. It would have been a dumb move, and I said that I don't know how many times on the air, but he did have the ability to do so. And so that's what he was referring to, and it's completely disingenuous for the Washington Post or anybody else to pretend as though what President Trump was actually saying is, oh no, when it comes to government, I can do whatever I want. Because here's the thing. Trump is not exactly a man known for restraint. If he actually believed he could do whatever he wanted, don't you think the wall would kind of be under construction by now? Like, if he really believed that he was an all-powerful dictator, don't you think that he would have tried a few more things than what he's done so far? So, making that case is just ridiculous. And when if Adam Schiff had said, under Article 1, the House has powers to do whatever we want in regards to impeachment, well, technically he's right. The Democrats are the majority party, and that's why you've seen all this one-sided coverage. That's the reason that you've seen just them pulling witnesses, not the Republicans. They're not allowed to do it. That's why you saw in the early stages of this, them doing everything behind closed doors where the American people couldn't see the process as it's rolling out, and Republicans were complaining about it. If you were to take a clip of Adam Schiff saying, look, we can do whatever we want, which would not be an incorrect analysis, at least from a legal perspective. Might think that it's not a good idea or that it's wrong, but from a legal perspective, Article 1 does give him the authority, and the Democrats, as long as they're in control, the authority to do whatever they want when it comes to the impeachment proceedings. Would I then take that clip of Adam Schiff saying I can do whatever I want according to Article 1 and say, see, Adam Schiff doesn't believe there are any limits to what Congress can do? No. That would be incorrect of me to do that, but that's exactly what the Democrats are doing when it comes to President Trump. That's the part that people really should have paid attention to in that clip by Pamela Karlan. But don't worry, guys. She's completely objective. And remember, this is the same person that said that there was a constitutional crisis back in March of 2017. So she waited 3 whole months. Wonder of restraint there. Waited 3 whole months into Trump's presidency to say, yeah, we got to get rid of the guy. I mean, it's just absurd. And this is another clip of the same lady, Pamela Karlan, in regards to President Trump. And it's very telling in her own sentimentality of who she thinks President Trump is and what she thinks of him.
I was struck, I came in from the airport yesterday and I got off the bus from Dulles down at L'Enfant Plaza and I walked up to the hotel. And as I was walking past what used to be the old post office building and is now the Trump Hotel, which I had to cross the street, of course. Are
you staying there?
God, no. Never.
Now, there have been people politically that I didn't like. Don't much care for the Clintons, although I dislike Hillary a lot more than I like Bill. I dislike Hillary a lot more than I dislike Bill. Never cared much for the Obamas. Don't really much like Martha Roby. But I would never think, oh, I can't even walk on the same side of the street as a building that has their name on it. And this is the person that the Democrats decided was a good third-party objective observer as to whether or not the president needs to be impeached. Are you kidding me? You couldn't have found somebody else, somebody that is a little less animosity towards the guy? This was the person they decided to bring in as the objective, what the Babylon Bee needs to do. And I hate telling the Babylon Bee what to do because they're brilliant. They typically wind up hitting the nail on the head without my help and probably better than I ever could. But the Babylon Bee, which is a satire site, they make up news stories and they do it for jokes. They need to write an article where Barack Obama, Rachel Maddow, and Kathy Griffin are going to be the new objective witnesses to determine whether or not the president should be impeached. Those Babylon Bee, you don't even have to pay me for that one. You get that one for free. That should be your next article, that the Democrats bring them in to testify as to whether or not President Trump should be impeached, because that's about the level that you saw with Pamela Karlan. But luckily, there was somebody that actually picked up on this and pointed out, here is Representative Matt Gaetz, who just absolutely, in the span of about 3 minutes, destroys any credibility that they had simply by stating the facts.
It's the will of the people you ignore when you continue down this terrible road of impeachment. Professor Gerhardt, you gave money to Barack Obama, right?
My family did, yes.
4 times?
That sounds about right. Yes.
Mr. Feldman wrote articles entitled, "Trump's Wiretap Tweets Raise Risk of Impeachment." He then wrote, "Mar-a-Lago ad belongs in impeachment file." And then Mr. Jake Flanagan wrote in Quartz, a Harvard law professor thinks Trump could be impeached over fake news accusations. My question, Professor Feldman, is since you seem to believe that the basis for impeachment is even broader than the basis that my Democrat colleagues have laid forward, do you believe you're outside of the political mainstream on the question of impeachment?
I believe that impeachment is warranted whenever the president abuses his power for personal benefit or to corrupt the democratic process.
Did you write an article entitled, "It's Hard to Take Impeachment Seriously Now"?
Yes, I did write that article.
And in that article, did you write, hold on, I'm limited on time, sir.
I wrote
did you
that
write,
article.
since the 2018 midterm election, House Democrats have made it painfully clear that discussing impeachment is primarily or even exclusively a tool to weaken President Trump's chances in 2020. Did you write those words?
Until this call on July 25th, I was an impeachment skeptic. The
Very
call
well.
changed
Okay.
my mind, sir, and for
Thank
good
you. I
reason.
appreciate your testimony. Professor Karlan, you gave $2,000, or you gave $1,000 to Elizabeth Warren, right?
I believe so.
You gave $1,200 to Barack Obama,
I have no reason to question that.
and you gave $2,000 to Hillary Clinton.
That's correct.
Why so much more for Hillary than the other two?
Because I've been giving a lot of money to charity recently because of all of the poor people in the United States.
Well, those aren't the only folks you've been given to. Now, have you ever been on a podcast called Versus Trump?
I think I was on a live panel that the people who ran the podcast called Versus Trump.
On that, do you remember saying the following? Liberals tend to cluster more. Conservatives, especially very conservative people, tend to spread out more, perhaps because they don't even want to be around themselves. Did you say that?
Yes, I did.
Do you understand how that reflects contempt on people who are conservative?
No, what I was talking about there was the natural tendency, if you put the quote in context, the natural tendency of a compactness requirement to favor a party whose voters are more spread out.
Well,
and I do not have contempt
hold on,
for conservatives
I'm
And I
very
do not have
limited on
contempt
time,
for
Professor. And so I just have to say, when you talk about how liberals want to be around each other and cluster, and conservatives don't want to be around each other, and so they have to spread out, it makes people, you may not see this from, like the ivory towers of your law school, but it makes actual people in this country
When
feel
the
like,
president
excuse
calls
me, you don't get to interrupt me on this time. Now, let me also suggest that when you invoke the president's son's name here, when you try to make a little joke out of referencing Barron Trump, that does not lend credibility to your argument. It makes you look mean. It makes you look like you're attacking someone's family, the minor child of the President of the United States. So let's see if we can get into the facts. To all of the witnesses, if you have personal knowledge of a single material fact in the Schiff report, please raise your hand. And let the record reflect no personal knowledge of a single fact. And you know what? That continues on the tradition that we saw from Adam Schiff, where Ambassador Taylor could not identify an impeachable offense. Mr. Kent never met with the president. Fiona Hill never heard the president reference anything regarding military aid. Mr. Hale was unaware of any nefarious activity with aid. Colonel Vindman even rejected the new Democrat talking point that bribery was invoked here. Ambassador Volker denied that there was a quid pro quo, and Mr. Morrison said there was nothing wrong on the call. The only direct evidence came from Gordon Sondland, who spoke to the President of the United States, and the President said, "I want nothing. No quid pro quo."
Okay, I'm not much of a Matt Gaetz fan. I think that he's way too much of a trumpet. I think that he's a little bit too go with whatever the president says kind of guy. But dang, I haven't seen a takedown like that in a while. I mean, that was epic. And within the span of about 3 minutes, I think he was given 5, but about 3 minutes in that clip that I just showed you, he completely undermined any shred of credibility any of those 3 witnesses had, and to a great part, undermined most of the credibility of just about anybody that had spoken at that testimony up to that point. And he didn't do it through clever trickery. He didn't do it through hiding the ball from anybody. He literally just laid out facts and pointed out that none of the people that we've talked to, except for one, even has firsthand information of the event in question. And that guy said there was no quid pro quo. I mean, we really are living in insane times. You know, the thing about that and everything that he just laid out, if you have a rock solid case, if you believe that you've got the goods, you don't believe that you have to lie. You don't believe that you have to cheat. You don't believe that you have to find witnesses that don't know anything about the event in question. When I was on the Parley Pro team, which is the form of debate that FFA does, it's the team that I was on, it's how I learned debate in the first place. There was a time where we were accused of cheating. And the only reason we were accused of it is because we were leagues ahead of every other team in our state. And that's not to disparage the other teams, it's just a couple things went right. We just happened to have a really good team. And we had a couple of really good teams back to back, and we just eviscerated people at the state. That was kind of in our golden era of debate at the Marbury FFA chapter. And because of that, because we were so overwhelmingly dominant, there were people that were questioning whether or not we were cheating. And my dad's response to it remained the same at the onset as it did when people finally just realized that we weren't cheating, we were just that good. We don't need to cheat. Why would we cheat? We're already leagues better than everybody else we're competing against. We have no reason to cheat. Why would we endanger our victory by cheating? And the reason behind that is the same reason that would be behind the Democrats if they had this case in the bag, which is, well, we don't have to just call witnesses. We don't have to stymie the Republicans and keep them from calling witnesses. We don't have to rush this thing through faster than the Flash on a Coke binge because we've got the goods on Trump. We have a rock-solid case for impeachment. That's not what you're seeing. You're seeing Adam Schiff give a parody, which he didn't say was a parody until weeks afterward when he got his hand caught in the cookie jar, a fictitious reading of the transcript. If they thought the transcript was good enough to get the guy impeached, he wouldn't have had to elaborate and editorialize and make up crap in the transcript. He would have just read the transcript. They've known from the beginning that they don't have a case. And that's why you're seeing constantly them trying to stack the deck in their favor. If you're confident that you've got a winning hand, you don't try to stack the deck. You don't need to. And yet, that is what we're seeing from the Democrats over and over and over again. If you really believe that the case for impeachment was rock solid, you wouldn't have to get well-known leftist lawyers. You would just bring in regular lawyers, people that don't have an agenda against the president. If you really believed that the case for impeachment was that cut and dry, you wouldn't feel the need to stack the deck that way. And here's the thing, and I'm normally incredibly critical of House Republicans especially, maybe even more so than the Senate from time to time, because I'm not going to go into all of it right now, but it grinds my gears. But anyway, I want to show you the lawyer that the Republicans brought in. And this is a guy who is not a well-known Republican, not well connected to a whole bunch of Republicans. He voted for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in the past 2 elections. This is not a Republican guy. The Republicans didn't have to bring in a Republican guy. They didn't have to bring in Rudy Giuliani or somebody like that, because they know that truth is on their side this time. And so here's a clip of that. This is Jonathan Turley, who testified with them. He's the only one that the Republicans were able to bring in.
You're saying Article 1 gives us complete authority that when we demand information from another branch, it must be turned over or we'll impeach you in record time. Now, making that worse is that you have such a short investigation. It's a perfect storm. You set an incredibly short period, demand a huge amount of information, and when the president goes to court, you then impeach him. Now, does that track with what you've heard about impeachment? Does that track with the rule of law that we talked about? So, on obstruction, I would encourage you to think about this. In Nixon, it did go to the courts, and Nixon lost. Do you know what that did for the judiciary is it gave this body legitimacy. It wasn't the Rodino extreme position that only you decide what information can be produced. Now, recently, there are some rulings against President Trump, including a ruling involving Don McGahn. Mr. Chairman, I testified in front of you a few months ago, and if you recall, we had an exchange, and I encouraged you to bring those actions. And I said I thought you would win, and you did. And I think it was an important win for this committee, because I don't agree with President Trump's argument in that case. But that's an example of what can happen if you actually subpoena witnesses and go to court. Then you have an obstruction case, because a court issues an order, and unless they stay that order by a higher court, you have obstruction. But I can't emphasize this enough, and I'll say it just one more time. If you impeach a president, if you make a high crime and misdemeanor out of going to the courts, it is an abuse of power. It's your abuse of power. You're doing precisely what you're criticizing the president for doing. We have a third branch that deals with conflicts of the other 2 branches. And what comes out of there and what you do with it is the very definition of legitimacy.
Now, with Jonathan Turley and what he said there, the big takeaway from this, and this has been something that I've noticed, you know that the Democrats are constantly trying to set traps. Because when it came to the stuff in the Mueller, in other words, Russian collusion, they said, oh, there's Russian collusion. And then when it was abundantly clear that there was no Russian collusion, they said, obstruction of justice. Well, there's no underlying crime there. And granted, you could still obstruct justice, theoretically, even if there is no underlying crime. But you'll notice they took all the focus off of that and they said, no, see, Trump was trying to obstruct justice. They're doing the same thing here. Originally, the impeachment was supposed to be because there was a quid pro quo with the president abusing his power to get something, dirt on his political rival from President Zelensky. And then when they saw, well, that case completely fell apart, no, we're going to try to get him on obstruction. We're going to try to get him on not turning over this information. By the way, you have to have all this information, just piles and piles of records. And if you don't get it to us in 24 hours, we're impeaching. It's so funny because they think they have a case. They overstep. Their case falls apart. And then they reach for the nearest lifeline to try to keep it going. This is the same formula they did with the Russian collusion thing. It didn't work then. I don't think it's going to work this time either. And this is a guy who not only was an Obama and Hillary voter, but has given advice to, good advice apparently, because he won in the courts, to Chairman Nadler. He's not somebody that is hostile towards Democrats, nor is he one that is a supporter of Trump, but he's just a law professor looking at the text of impeachment and what is required for it and saying, sorry, y'all don't have it. Here's what I think is going on here. The Democrats are hopped up like a junkie on the thought of impeaching the president. And all of their junkie friends that are also hopped up on the idea of impeaching the president, like the 3 lawyers that you saw before him, they're saying, yeah, man, go ahead and do it. They're the ones that got them hooked on this in the first place, the activist class. They're the ones that got them hooked on the drug. In comes Jonathan Turley, not a Republican, saying, I actually like you guys, and y'all need to knock it off because it's hurting you. Turley's the concerned friend trying to stage an intervention because he's legitimately worried about what the Democrats are doing. And right now, the Democrats are completely ignoring him and going with their junkie friends because it's what sounds better to them. I think what's going to happen is they're going to look back at this and say, yep, that was the moment we probably should have turned around and cut our losses. That's the moment we probably should have given up on impeachment. That's the moment we should have realized this was a fool's errand. But it seems as though the Democrats are committed to, bound and determined to shoot themselves in the foot with this impeachment. And I think it's going to eventually end in them losing any chance they had at winning the presidency, no matter who the candidate is. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today, it comes from the book of Ephesians. And it kind of goes back to the first story that we were talking about. Because I think that we have a real problem sometimes remembering who our enemies are. Sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking because we want peace, we don't want to struggle, we want to be friends with people. And I'm talking about this on both the physical and the spiritual sense, which will become evident when you look at what passage we're going to be looking at. It's very easy for us to be drawn into error and sin because we don't like struggling against it. And that's understandable. Nobody likes struggling against it. It's called a struggle for a reason. You don't like doing it. But sometimes our desire for peace, our desire to not fight, our desire to just, be okay with everybody, blinds us to our actual task here on this earth. And in this passage in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 12, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God, so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now, the reason that Paul is reminding them of this Because you have to remember, Christians were being persecuted at the time he's writing this letter to Ephesus. That was a terrible thing. And Christians being persecuted and being harmed or killed or imprisoned simply for believing in Jesus Christ and being unwilling to not confess him before others. That is a really horrible thing. But what Paul is saying here is ultimately you have to remember the fight is not physical. The fight is not a war against an actual army or a nation. It's a spiritual battle. And I think a lot of Christians have been drawn in to a conflict without realizing that. We tend to think, I don't know how many people, and by the way, I've heard people on the left say it more recently. I've heard people on the right say it. Well, when are we going to just take up arms and take over? There are evil aspects of people within our country, within our communities, that would like nothing more than to see Christianity driven clean out of society. The way we're going to beat them is not with guns. The way we're going to beat them is not with combat, even in the rhetorical sense. Ultimately, our enemy is spiritual, not physical. And so let's be careful to not be drawn into a second error because of the first. Let's not be drawn into this false dichotomy where, oh, well, we really hate these guys and they hate us, so we need to do something that's immoral against them. We need to be drawn into this conflict and go after somebody else. No, that's not what we're taught to do. You see, as a Christian, and I'm not saying that there's never a time to use violence or fight. I've done lessons on that. Go look them up if you want to. That's not really the point of what I'm saying today. It is so easy for us to lose sight of who our enemy is. And most of the time, the enemy is ourself. You notice in the book of David, for example, who was David's greatest adversary? Saul? No. I mean, Saul did some horrible things to him, don't get me wrong. But David's biggest struggle, his biggest failings didn't come at the hand of Saul. Sure, he had to kind of roam around like a vagabond for a few years, which was definitely not ideal. Was it Absalom, his own son? No. Absalom, horrible and corrupt as he is, he was really only kind of a thorn in David's side for a little while, and then David retook his throne. And David was, at least to what we know about it, never in any real danger from either one of them because God looked after him and protected him. To our knowledge, he never had an actual physical confrontation with either one. Now, other people did on his behalf. One of his men, of course, killed Absalom, beheaded him. But ultimately, the greatest struggle of David's life was against himself, against his own failings, his own desires and lust. Absalom was the result of him coddling his son and not being a good father the way that he knew he should have been. And was also part of the punishment of his sin with Bathsheba. You see, David's an amazing individual that overcame a lot, but what's most important about his story is that he overcame his own demons. Of course, he had to do it with God's help, but ultimately that's the struggle that we need to focus on. It's not about who wins the next election. It's not about what country is the most dominant in the military, and I'm not saying that these things aren't important. Obviously, I'm in a business that cares a great deal about those things. I'm just saying that we have to remember that our true struggle is against darkness, against evil, against temptations inside ourself. That is the greatest struggle of this life. And it is one that we can only win once we have put on Christ in baptism and dedicated our lives to following in his footsteps. I'm not saying other things don't matter, but ultimately that is the only thing that is going to matter in the end. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 29.